The Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRES 965 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I will now recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we are holding a hearing on improving access to quality public education in Africa to discuss the ways in which the United States can help enhance the delivery of quality education on the continent. To lead that conversation, I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. The Honorable David Singh, Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education for the Office of the President in Sierra Leone, Dr. Rebecca Winthrop, Senior Fellow and Co-Director for the Brookings Institution in the Center for Universal Education, Ms. Yasmine Sherif, Director of Education Cannot Wait, and Mr. Robert Kaufman, Executive Director of the Abaarso Network. I welcome your testimony and the discussion surrounding it. I look forward to hearing from our experts to describe the ways in which the U.S. can strengthen basic education systems in Africa and what we can do to increase access to quality schooling, be it public or private. Across the continent, to varying degrees, the pre-primary, primary, middle, and secondary education system, what we in the United States would generally refer to as pre-K to 12, or basic education, requires support. The African Union's Continental Strategy for Africa from 2016 to 2025 reports progress in expanding access to primary education across Africa from 59 to 79% between 1999 and 2012. However, these gains could be increased should there be greater policy emphasis and investment in target areas such as pre-primary education, educating girls and children with disabilities, increasing funding for infrastructure and educators. These types of strategies are important and must be specific to local context, but the fundamental goal remains the same: get all children to school early, develop solutions to coherently link the stages of basic education to ensure they acquire a strong foundation without an interruption. It's disheartening to hear that by the time children reach primary school age, an estimated 34 million of them go unenrolled. The trend continues and is even greater for middle and secondary school-age children, respectively. The COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated these challenges through the closure of schools, pushing hundreds of millions of students out of school since the beginning of the pandemic. I feel it is important for us to do more to create policy and investment opportunities on the continent to improve access to education. This Congress, I plan on introducing a bill that focuses on promoting access to inclusive, uninterrupted, quality pre-primary and secondary education in Africa, reauthorizing the Reinforcing Education Accountability Act, also known as the READ Act. I want to prioritize the importance of education at a young age that goes uninterrupted because these children will grow to contribute to the expanding and growing economies on the continent, which will in turn strengthen the continent's capacity for self-reliance. In recent discussions with USAID education experts, I learned that under the auspices of the READ Act, the United States seeks to work within local contexts to improve quality and expand access to education across the continent. Beyond its traditional engagement, USAID is expanding outreach to include non-governmental education providers through new financing approaches. Again, the goal is to improve the quality of education and to reach more children as early as possible and have them finish both levels. These fresh ideas are needed and must be realized to meet the mutually beneficial goals of the U.S. and Africa. Further, it must be a priority for U.S. national security interests to educate on the importance of democratic principles and free market economies. Hopefully, young people will be taught about democracy, the rule of law, free speech, freedom of the press and assembly, and have the hope of real prospects of employment that these ideals provide and protect. Finally, children who have access to quality education go on to partake in opportunities for young professionals through programs such as the Young African Leaders Initiative, which includes the Mandela Washington Fellowship that I introduced and passed in the House, the YALI Act, to strengthen young leaders' knowledge and skills. I now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of making his opening statement.
I thank you very much, and I want to thank my good friend and colleague, Chairwoman Karen Bass, for convening today's very important hearing on improving access to quality public education in Africa. I know that this is a topic that she is passionate about, and over the years, she has repeatedly shown her deep concern for Africa's youth, or indeed Africa's future. Pardon me. This has been shown by her efforts while here in Congress as first ranking member and then chair of the Africa Subcommittee to solidify and strengthen the Young African Leaders Initiative, or YALI. It is also demonstrated by her convening today's hearing on improving access to quality public education. I think one of the concerns which we have shared over the years is the compelling need for the state sector throughout Africa to provide for the people, be it in the area of health, education, or simply protection and good governance. Thus, while reviewing successes and what works and is important, we also need to realize that in many countries, a robust public education system is at this point aspirational, and that has to change. Indeed, if you go to a place such as the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which is very remote from the capital of Kinshasa, and I know I've been there twice, we see a minimal state presence in education as well as in healthcare. Thus, there is a role for the private education as well, and in particular, faith-based schools. This is especially true in Africa, which, as a witness at one of our hearings a few years ago put it, is a faith-based continent. Indeed, there is probably no institution more active at the grassroots level of communities throughout sub-Saharan Africa than the churches and variously affiliated schools, be they Christian or Muslim. And in all education efforts, we need to place the interests of children, their parents and families, as paramount. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights envisions a system of free education, quote, directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Wisely, the Universal Declaration also proclaims that, quote, parents shall have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children, close quote. With these words from the great inspirational and aspirational document, I look forward to this hearing. And again, I thank my good friend for convening it. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your comments. I would now like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. First, we have the Honorable David Sengeh. He's the Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education and the Chief Innovation Officer for the Government of Sierra Leone. He also serves as the chair of the advisory board of UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report, board member of the Global Partnership for Education, and a member of the high-level steering committee for Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is equality education. Next, we have Dr. Rebecca Winthrop. She is a senior fellow and co-director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. Her research focuses on education globally, with special attention to the skills young people need to thrive in work, life, and as constructive citizens. She was educated at Columbia University Teachers College, Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and Swarthmont College. Our third witness is Ms. Yasmine Sherif. She is the Director of Education Cannot Wait, a global fund for education in emergencies and protracted crises established by the World Humanitarian Summit. A lawyer specialized in international humanitarian law and human rights law, she has 30 years of experience with the UN and international NGOs. She served in some of the most crisis-affected countries on the globe. I would now like, and our final witness is Mr. Robert Kaufman. Mr. Kaufman has been a co-founder, director, and senior representative for humanitarian education institutions for 2 decades. He began his career as a grant-funded researcher in West Africa, working for Save the Children and the American Red Cross in various positions on 4 continents. We appreciate all of you being here today and look forward to your testimony. Your written statements will appear in the hearing record, and under committee rule number 6, each witness should limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement And I believe there will be a clock that you will see on the screen when your 5 minutes is up. And with that, I would like to welcome our first guest again, our first witness, Dr. David Sengeh.
Chair Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to this important hearing on improving access to quality public education in Africa. While I must admit it is a tough task to speak on behalf of the entire African continent, I do also believe that investment in quality public education is the closest thing we have to a silver bullet that solves the world's intractable problems. If we achieve this, we will lay the foundation for gender equality, climate action, social inclusion, and economic growth. In Sierra Leone, upon assuming office in 2018, His Excellency President Julius Maada Bio announced the free quality school education program for all children in public schools. 3 years in, we have simultaneously improved access, quality, and gender equity. And all this is against the backdrop of COVID-related school closures. On access between 2018 and 2020, we added more than 700,000 new learners to our schools. We've achieved this while attaining gender parity in enrollment at nearly all levels. We have more girls than boys in primary and junior secondary schools, and we're actively working to improve transition of girls into senior secondary and into tertiary and higher institutions. On quality, we now have more students sitting and passing the national transition exams than at any point in our country's history. For junior secondary school, we were able to improve the pass rate from 72% to 79% in 3 years, while adding more than 40,000 students to the examination roster. Although hard, we're seeing that this is possible and to achieve quality while expanding access. We've also made significant headway on our early grade reading and math assessments, known as EGRA-EGMA. I'm proud to say that across nearly all reading and math tasks, we've cut the percentage of students who score 0 in half since the last assessment in 2014. How did Sierra Leone get there? In a word, we invested. We paid a full bill for school fees in public schools and paid the examination fees for nearly all students. Moreover, we've hired more than 12,000 teachers, increased all teachers' salaries by 30%, and doubled down on continuous professional development. In addition, we invested in new teaching and learning materials and school feeding programs. We believe that children must have access to nutritious meals for learning and their holistic development. We've created a new set of curricula relevant for the 21st century at all school levels. Furthermore, we innovated. For example, we introduced digital SMS-based learning tools, including the free SMS dictionary, where students can now check their exam results and school placements on their mobile phones instead of waiting for the paper results to travel to their schools. Our digital tools have been used millions of times. Just recently, we introduced the Learning Passport, which gives students access to past exam papers. On the first day, it was downloaded 4,000 times. We also launched the Education Innovation Challenge, where service providers support primary schools to generate evidence on how learning can even be further improved. This year, we'll scale the concept to cover more than 100,000 children. Our goal is clear. We should have impact and learn through the process of achieving that. We've laid the policy groundwork for education to improve on all fronts. Our radical inclusion policy ensures the inclusion of girls, especially pregnant ones, disabled learners, learners from remote areas, and learners from impoverished backgrounds in our educational system. We've already overturned the 2010 ban on pregnant girls attending school, and we're only getting started. This year, we'll update the Education Act of 2004 to match our aspirations. All told, we're spending 22% of our national budget on education. We have made hard choices to protect this budget, but we are confident that Sierra Leone will reap the rewards for decades to come. In the year of COVID-19, Sierra Leone is one of the few countries to have expanded its education budget. This has been our journey, but we are very far from finished. So how can the United States help accelerate progress? I serve as board member on GPE, and I believe that it is the best vehicle for pooling international efforts to accelerate progress towards our common educational goals. The US has supported the GPE generously over the years, but if the distinguished members will forgive me for the observation, these contributions are surpassed by the cumulative contributions from countries such as Denmark, whose populations are smaller than the state of Maryland. In short, the GPE is the best place to start, and I believe the United States can do more. On a personal note, I studied in the United States for 10 years. I know that when the United States supports bold goals alongside the international community, there's nothing that can stop us. To underscore my point, I think I need only mention PEPFAR to recall the United States' massive investment in saving millions of lives and helping African countries control the HIV/AIDS epidemic. This kind of investment is now needed in quality public education. Sierra Leone will be honored to deepen our partnership with you on the journey to improving access to quality public education. Together, nothing can stop us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Rebecca Winthrop.
Hello, thank you very much for having me, Representative Bass, Representative Omar, Representative Smith, and the distinguished members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here. I am sharing my perspectives from my personal experience, both as a practitioner on the continent for some years, and also in our current work at the Center for Universal Education. We work with about 35 African partners across 21 countries, including a host of about 12 fellows on girls' education. We have a girls' education fellowship every year who are based in sub-Saharan Africa. I am really, really thrilled that you're focused on this. It is such an important issue for all the reasons you said, but you know, it's important for Africa, but it's important for the whole globe. Africa is the youngest continent in the world. 60% of the population is below the age of 25, and by 2050 it'll be home to about 70% of the world's working age population. It is literally going to be the global talent pool for everybody, and so we really do need to put education at the center. In terms of what the United States can do, in 2010 I wrote a piece when I came to Brookings initially called "Punching Below Its Weight: the US government's approach to education in the developing world." And the reason I came to that assessment was because I found that there were 13 different agencies working on education and development with very little coordination and synergy, and the sum of the parts, you know, did not make for a greater impact. I am really pleased that this is beginning to change. With the US government strategy on international and basic education, which came to being in 2019 and is coming up in 2023, this is really the first time this whole of government approach has been taken. I urge the committee to make sure this is renewed. We're seeing the benefits already. And I would put forward the recommendation to renew this with 4 main additional focus areas. I have 4 recommendations. The first one is really around harnessing the innovative capacity of African communities. One of the things that I note, and a lot of our partners talk about, is that anytime you get in a discourse about foreign aid or international development, there's lots of problems, which there are, but it really obscures all the innovation and creativity and ingenuity on the ground that African communities are using to solve their problems every day. I've done a global study of education innovation around the world and found a very robust education innovation sector on the continent. And we hear a lot from our partners about US government strategies funding that. So bilaterally, I would continue the small steps that the basic education strategy has started of funding more local partners and really flip it, really put African innovators and actors at the center and bring the international community into support them rather than the other way around. And secondly, I agree wholeheartedly with Minister Sengeh. Increasing multilaterally support for GPE would be very important. The entire approach puts African governments at the center. And at the moment, the US gives about 125 million, which is annually, which is a far cry from the 1.5 billion annually it gives to the Global Fund for Health. So that's recommendation 1. Recommendation 2 is to keep focusing on enriched teaching and learning experiences around foundational literacy and numeracy. This is an area the US government has really led on. It is no time to take your eye off the prize. 18% of children and youth, only 18% master basic foundational literacy and numeracy, and we're in stable context, working to train teachers on differentiated instruction and more interactive pedagogies, and scaling that approach that is shown to be effective is great. The US government should do more, though, to think about flexible approaches like catch-up classes and tablet-based learning that have been shown to work without having a consistent teacher for all the kids, whether it be COVID or conflict or climate impacts, that aren't able to regularly access stable education and learning. Additionally, family engagement and really supporting communities to support their kids' learning has shown to be highly cost-effective, and I would encourage the US government to invest more there.
Thank you.
My third recommendation is around investing in models of learning to prepare youth for the workforce. There are estimates that there's about 175 billion needed in sub-Saharan Africa to educate all kids in secondary education, but only 25 billion currently is being invested. This is a big area, wide open. There's not one massive global, sort of global bilateral leading on it. The US could really harness its whole of government approach and bring in the public-private partnerships that are needed to actually revolutionize what secondary education looks like on the continent. There's huge demands from people like Minister Sengeh and others with very large youth populations that have only been exacerbated by COVID. And the US government could play a lead role.
Thank you, Dr.
My fourth and last recommendation is really around leading on system transformation for climate change. This is an area that we are just in the education sector beginning to grapple with. Only 25% of countries around the world even mention children's youth education in their national climate plans.
Excuse me, Winthrop.
Yes.
Your time is up, but we'll
Okay.
give additional time.
Thank you.
In Q&A. Let me now introduce Ms. Yasmine Sherif.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I'll really do my best to stick to the time. I got very long talking points here, testimony. Distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify on the improving access to quality education in Africa. And the United States leadership is critically important, and we really appreciate the investments made by you. So as I was introduced, I'm the Director of Education Cannot Wait, which is the world's first global fund for education in emergency and protracted crisis, and we're a global fund that is hosted by the United Nations. And we were founded and became operational in 2017. The United States is a key donor to Education Cannot Wait and has pledged a total of $82.3 million and is therefore also one of our largest contributors. These have been very timely contributions, especially in our cooperation with the United States in Africa, where we worked in the Sahel and many of the countries in the neighboring countries. Now, for my testimony, I drew on over 30 years of working with the United Nations in crisis countries, including in Africa, such as Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, and have led many missions to the Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa. When you go to the Sub-Saharan Africa, you see that of all the urgencies we have around the globe when it comes to the education sector, that is the most underfunded and the most, I would say, lacking the most basic infrastructure for quality education. They are truly those left furthest behind. Now, there are the importance of education, and we all understand that. If we do not provide young children and youth in Africa with education, not only is it a legal or a moral responsibility, but it's a game changer that will eventually impact not only the African continent, but all of us. Here we speak about an estimated in total globally 128 million refugees and displaced populations in crisis, of whom the majority are in Africa. So just imagine they not receiving a quality education today, how that will impact not only the region, but the rest of the world in the near future. So in Africa especially, we also have to focus on girls' education and the benefits of investing in girls, because that's also a benefit for the family and for the communities. And it's more about, it's not just about getting girls into school, but also making sure that they have a safe school environment to go to. Just look at Nigeria and the Boko Haram, where girls are being kidnapped going to school. So it's safety. It's about curriculum that are gender sensitized so that these young girls one day can be empowered, educated leaders. And it also is about nutrition, health. No child, no girl can go to school on a hungry stomach. Now, if you look at the situation across Africa, there have been, of course, achievements over the past 20 years. But we also know that there's a huge gap that remains. In year 2000, almost a third of the primary school-aged children were out of school. Now, by 2019, this had decreased to 17%. So in 19 years, we saw a decrease because investments were made and basic education were made compulsory across Africa. So this indeed progress has been made. However, despite this progress, Africa continues to face the highest rate of out-of-school children and adolescents. The sub-Saharan Africa has the highest rates of education inclusion in Africa. Over 1/5 of the children between the ages of 6 to 11 are out of school, followed by 1/3 of youth between the ages of about 12 to 14. And according to data from UNESCO's Institute for Statistics, almost 60% of school-age children between ages 15 and 17 are not in school. And so we see definitely that situation is going to worsen, and to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 4, access to a quality education, again, they are left furthest behind. And if we don't achieve that goal, all other sustainable development goals will fall behind, because without an education, we cannot have gender equality, we cannot eradicate poverty, hunger, and so forth. So the scale of the challenge is quite remarkable. What is important for Education Cannot Wait is it's not enough to bring children and youth back to school. It's also to achieve learning outcomes, that they actually learn something. We need to make sure that teachers are properly trained. We make sure that we are not excluding the refugees, and that we take a holistic whole of child approach, and that we reach all girls and adolescents and focus on children with disabilities. I'm afraid that my time is running out. I can see that. There's much more of my talking points, but again, I thank you very much for inviting Education Cannot Wait, the Global Fund for Education and Emergency in the United Nations, to provide this testimony. Thank you very much, and thank you for all the generous support from the United States of America.
Thank you very much. Our final witness is Mr. Robert Kaufman.
Hello, thank you, Chair Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee for an opportunity to testify at this hearing. My name is Rob Kaufman, and I'm the Executive Director of the Abaarso Network. I'm here to share extraordinary stories of success and lessons we can draw from this experience to improve access to quality education in Africa. In 2009, an American social entrepreneur set out to create a rigorous, inclusive high school that would transform Somaliland. Despite the fact that many of our students entered with little or no English, some had never even been to school before, they absolutely thrived. In a few short years, our graduates were earning full scholarships to some of the world's most elite universities. There was Mubarak, a nomad who had never been to school before, who earned a full scholarship to MIT. And Nadira, whose father was reluctant to send his daughters to school at all, who very likely became the first woman from Somaliland to get a full scholarship to an Ivy League school when she was accepted at Yale. In the last 8 years, more than 200 Abaarso students have earned over $37 million in scholarships for schools around the world. But that's not even the best part of the story. While the Abaarso model is highly successful, we needed a scalable model built around local staff and day schools to reach thousands more. So we created the Kabe model, the first ever Montessori primary schools in Somaliland. Today, there are 3 Kabe schools serving over 200 students. In order to staff our Kabe schools, we created an all-female residential college called Barwaco University that today offers 1 degree, a degree in education. Last year, we had our first graduating class. 16 women graduated, and we hired 15 of them. As we continue to grow, many alumni have returned from abroad to teach or manage our schools. In fact, both Barwaco and Kabe included Abaarso graduates as co-founders. How did Abaarso realize such success in one of the most fragile and complex settings in the world? Here's a brief explanation, although definitely not comprehensive. From the beginning, Abaarso set extremely high expectations. Students go to class 5.5 days a week and have significantly more learning time than typical schools. By the time someone graduates from Abaarso, they know what's at stake: opportunities for scholarship, self-improvement, and a career, and they have the skills and confidence to achieve them. Our founding teams worked with local leaders to ensure that we honored local customs, like including a mosque on campus and the establishment of a local board. The mission of the school, to graduate the leaders of tomorrow and transform Somaliland, is reinforced every day. We fully expect Abaarso graduates will be leaders at the highest levels of public service and commercial enterprise, driving development, innovation, and inclusion. The stories of success inspired huge demand. Parents like Nadira's father, once skeptical about Abaarso, have become some of our most vocal advocates. Today, we accept less than 3% of our applicant pool. Here are 3 recommendations to take from our experience that would help improve access to quality education in Africa. 1, invest in quality with better teachers. More than computers or any other resource, the teacher is the single biggest factor in student success. Provide a great teacher, and you can change the trajectory of a child's life. 2, generate demand by incentivizing success. In many communities throughout Africa, sending a child to school may jeopardize a family farm or business. There is often little sense that it will lead to genuine opportunity. We have to change the cost-benefit analysis so that families believe the education offered is worth their time and money. Curricula that are context-specific and partnerships with local employers give students the skills and networks to be competitive in local markets. And 3, more access. We have to redefine public education. Government alone will never be able to manage the supply side of education. We must leverage the impact of the interest of impact investors, social entrepreneurs, and others to mobilize resources. Non-state schools are already ubiquitous in much of sub-Saharan Africa. These schools can work in tandem with local authorities. Influential partners should energize and finance public systems that support choice and scaling models at work. In conclusion, Abaarso Network is a rare solution in a fragile setting, with evidence of success raising learning outcomes, creating gender equity, and increasing productive employment. Abaarso was fortunate to get support from USAID ASHA in 2015, but we first had to prove our success. And since ASHA only funds secondary and post-secondary schools, we still had to raise philanthropic dollars for primary schools. To scale quality education in Africa, partners must capitalize on demand for these models and support their growth. Replicating models that work is in the interest of the government from the United States. Failure to improve access to quality education breeds poverty and leaves few options for young people, which can drive violence and extremism. When people have tasted great offering and are hungry for more, the U.S. should put its full weight behind these programs and give youth and their families a reason to hope. As Abaarso has shown, doing so can transform entire communities. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kaufman. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony, and we will now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. But before we begin, I'll start with questions. Let me ask Erica if you would come back with a little instruction for members and witnesses.
Sure. Hello, everyone. So the timer, the easiest way to see the timer and ensure that you are within the 5-minute time allotment is if you go up to the right-hand corner and click Layout. You can click the option of Grid. Then you will be able to see the 5-minute timer. Or additionally, you can click the Stack option, hover over the timer. There is a button with 3 little dots on it. Click that and press Move to Stage. Therefore, the timer will remain stationary and it'll be within your view. Hopefully that is more helpful to everybody.
Thank you very much, Erica. I would like to ask my first question to Dr. Winthrop, who was in the middle of giving us recommendations around the READ Act, and I wanted her to finish. I think she was on recommendation 4.
Thank you, Representative Bass, and I now see the timer, which I did not before, so that was helpful. Yes, recommendation 4 was basically the idea that climate change is here and education systems are not prepared. And we in the education sector have not really put our arms around what would a climate smart education system actually look like. And this is something that the US government has started to do. I think, with the whole of government approach in the basic ed strategy, it could really be a leader in this space. And there's huge need. Given what I said before about the fact that, only 25% of countries even mention education in their climate plans.
Let me ask you something, because you were talking about the innovation on the ground, and talking about the READ Act and the fact that the READ Act funds educational organizations. It sounded as though you were emphasizing that we need to fund, instead of the massive NGOs that are US based or other countries, that we need to fund African organizations. Is that what you were saying earlier?
That is what I was trying to say, perhaps not as clearly as you. The new strategy, go ahead.
Well, my question to you, and to also Dr. Sengeh, who I'll move to in a quick second, because I only have 3 minutes left. How do we identify those organizations, and are there particular countries that have a number that we should focus on, a number of strong organizations?
I think that actually there are lots of people who could help the US government identify these strong organizations. We have a running list of several hundred. There's many other organizations that do that. I would go to Minister Sengeh and his peers. The GPE has an entire civil society and sort of empowerment theme. They could help identify organizations.
Okay.
So I think there's absolutely good ways to do it.
Okay, Dr. Sengeh?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Let me ask you, hold on a second. You talked about GPE and that the United States needed to support that more. Are you suggesting that READ Act funding should go to that? But what about US government supporting the public sector of different countries? And is there recommendations that you have there?
Yes, I do. I do think, yes, the US should expand its support to GPE. GPE is the largest fund dedicated to developing countries in education. And I think the US should definitely expand its support there. And in terms of the conversation that you were just having with Dr. Winthrop, we actually just published a blog on the GPE website today that talks about an NGO consortium. It includes global international NGOs and local NGOs who are working with governments to deploy lots of advanced solutions here, particularly with our response to COVID. And it's quite interesting to see what we were able to do together. But other institutions like the MCC, the MCC does not generally support education, but one of the metrics that are looked at for seeing whether a country is eligible is education, and girls' education and completion levels. So I think that's also really important. And I will then say supporting things like MCC, which ultimately supports infrastructure based on the indicators like school completion, are all very important that I think that the US government can do.
You mentioned the US government support, and I think you compared it to Denmark. Was that support for GPE, or was that support for another program?
That's yeah. Thank you very much, Republican Bass, Representative Bass.
Thank you.
And the US government from inception has paid, I think, about 550 million, whereas the Norwegian government has about 800 million cumulative to GPE. And I think the US government can support more in GPE. And the reason why I stress GPE is not because I'm on the board for it. It's because I know that Sierra Leone, for example, has benefited tremendously. And most of our programs, particularly with early childhood education and primary education, comes from such multilateral support.
Okay, thank you. And I would now go to the ranking member, Mr. Smith. Is Mr. Smith with us? If not, because I know he was going to have to step away. If not, I would go to Mr. Issa.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I was almost ready. Mr. Kaufman, how does your organization tailor the curriculum to training students to make sure they receive and ensure that they're prepared for jobs? In other words, it's very expensive to educate generally. If we educate generally in Africa where there isn't enough money, we're obviously not going to educate the amount we need. So how do you get that focus of education that leads to specific employment? And how do you determine what those employment opportunities are?
That's great. Can you hear me all right?
I sure can.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the question. It's so important that when we design a degree program at our university, it's done in consultation with the private sector and the largest employers in Somaliland. So right now we have 100% education to employment from our graduates, but that's because our private sector partner is largely ourselves. We need to generate many more teachers in order to scale the Kabe primary schools. So we're generating ready, professional, qualified educators and hiring them. Our next degree will be a management degree that we're talking with the leading CEOs and private sector companies throughout the country to make sure that they're informing our curriculum and the people that they need to hire in the next 5 and 10 years are the ones that we're graduating. So it's that partnership that's really key.
That's great. What I'd like you to do, and I think each of our witnesses could help us in this, how do we contrast things like what we're doing? You know, what you're doing is very similar to what Ohio did with its land grant universities. All the original public universities were teaching universities because that had the greatest leverage for the future. If you teach the teacher, you can then teach the next generation of students. But how would you contrast that with how China is competing with us in Africa? What are they doing and what makes your program different?
Well, I have to admit, I'm not expert enough to comment on the Chinese government strategy around education. I can tell you that in Somaliland, because of its unique status as an unrecognized country that's formally considered part of Somalia, they don't have access to financial aid and assistance from most multilateral institutions or the Chinese government. So in Somaliland, there's very little investment from the Chinese government. But otherwise, we just need to make sure that from the primary school up through secondary and into our university, that we're adapting the curricula based on the local context. And I think it was Honorable Minister Sengeh who talked about that they were doing the same thing to make sure that their graduates were ready for the workforce. So I just think it's a matter of being flexible, but maybe Dr. Sherif can respond vis-a-vis China.
Please. Maybe I'll respond. My understanding is that China doesn't prioritize any actual equivalent of what we would call U.S. aid for these kinds of purposes, has some training programs related to their projects. I'm going to follow up with just one question. The kind of support we're giving to your organization, Mr. Kaufman, are you seeing any other nations step forward? And if so, would you recognize them, either in Somaliland or in the case of the other witnesses? Because I'd like to understand who our best partners are. And I often see what we're doing, but I don't see similar partnerships with other countries. Obviously, France has a huge presence. Are they doing something similar or helping in this project?
We do have some really strong partners, but very few of them are financial sponsors, particularly from governmental entities. The British government has been a good friend to the Abaarso Network in providing advice and support, but so far they're not a financial contributor. And the government of Somaliland also has provided.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have any examples
Sure.
of other foreign nations?
In Sierra Leone, I do think the EU is a great supporter of education. So we've been able to see what the EU is doing. And now we have the Africa EU summit just next week that many of the AU leaders will be at. I think with China, for example, something that China does differently is with government grants to higher and technical institutions. I benefited from scholarships in the US, but it wasn't through the US government. And I think you see what the UK does through the Commonwealth scholarships, or with the Chinese or with the Russian. There are many country level scholarships. We know that in the US, that's much different. And that's a major difference.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass, and greetings to all of our witnesses today. I think it's fair to say that U.S. support for public education programs in Africa can't and shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all approach. So I'd love to talk about best practices. Mr. Kaufman and Dr. Sengeh, starting with you. Mr. Kaufman, in fact, a group from Minnesota, my home state, from the Wellstone School, traveled to your school, Abaarso in Somaliland recently to see your secrets of success. And I know Sierra Leone has seen a lot of progress in access and quality of education since they introduced universal public education just a few years ago. I'm sure there are many other successes in other countries, and would love if you might each speak to some of those. What scalable and replicable and cost beneficial best practice models can other countries draw on to improve baseline education? Dr. Sengeh, if you want to start, I'd welcome your comments. Other models.
I mean, I think one of the things that's worked really well for us in Sierra Leone is this relationship between civil society and not just with NGOs, but it's not just about government, it's a government. And we see that the relationship with civil society, the relationship with NGOs, including parents there. And in Sierra Leone, we have a decentralization for basic education that we're trying to move forward. So that also works very well in terms of effective models for quality education. And something I do want to also emphasize and stress on is the use of technology and digitization. And there are different parts to that. It can't be disparate. You know, with COVID school closures, every country had their own platform. I imagine the US, every state had their own platform, their own systems, their own content, and it doesn't work that way. And I think we really have to think about how we share the architecture and the technology systems such that we are taking advantage of our best resources in terms of quality content, quality platform, modes of engagement that actually reaches and includes as many more people as possible.
Well, and just quickly before we move to Mr. Kaufman, are there any of the external development partners in Africa that have made interesting investments of which you're aware that we should take note of?
I think the EU, and I think for girls' education, we do a lot of work with Irish Aid. So I mentioned radical inclusion, which is that we'll stop at nothing to everybody, girls. But organizations like Irish Aid, FCDO, we do have a lot of work with evidence-based policy support from FCDO. And as I mentioned, China in higher and technical institutions. I think there does need to be, and I think one of the respondents mentioned, USAID needs to step up a little bit in education. I must say in Sierra Leone, we don't have a large footprint of USAID, particularly on education and innovation, and I feel like that's a miss for the US.
I appreciate the challenge to us. Thank you, sir. Mr. Kaufman, any thoughts on scalable and replicable models that you think could be employed across the continent?
Yeah, thank you. First, let me just take a moment to acknowledge and really thank the group from Wellstone International School. They are great fun, great friends of ours. They've been out to the school and we've been talking with them about a deeper project. to draw some of those lessons that can help kids in Minnesota and perhaps beyond. So thanks so much for acknowledging them. Yeah, there are a few really important takeaways that go beyond the three that I mentioned, and I want to highlight those again. It was said by a few of the witnesses that it's not just about access. It's not just about the supply side of schools. Equally critical is the quality of what we're offering and the relevance in the classroom. Good teachers make a huge difference, and 10 great teachers are much better than 100 bad or mediocre teachers.
Sure.
The other side of that is this demand piece. You know, the cost-benefit analysis that families have to do to decide if it's worth the time and money to send their kids. If there aren't job prospects, if there aren't postgraduate or secondary opportunities, if they're leaving a good primary school but have no decent secondary school to go to, then the incentive to continue your education is greatly diminished, and that has a deleterious effect on the prospects of employment, innovation, economic growth. Just really quickly, the few other things I want to mention is I think that key are to scale or to incentivize, both with financial incentives and otherwise, public-private partnerships. We have to promote choice. As you said, one size does not fit all. We need a proliferation of models. And then when we find one that works, we have to hold on to it and invest in it. The other thing is businesses can also be incentivized to provide not just scholarships, but apprenticeships and internships. Because in developed countries, we know that your network plays a huge role in your job prospects post-graduation. We need to help kids in remote and fragile settings develop those same networks.
Okay, and I'm out of time. Thank you both. Appreciate your perspectives and contributions. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
And thank you, Mr. Phillips. It's my understanding that Mr. Musser is not here, so I will go to the committee Vice Chair, Representative Omar, who will chair the rest of this meeting. Thank you very much, Representative Omar.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass. Thank you for convening this really important discussion as well. Mr. Sengeh, according to UNICEF, the COVID pandemic has created the worst crisis of education access on record. But you talked in your testimony about Sierra Leone's success in continuing to invest in education during the pandemic. Can you tell us more about the programs you instituted to ensure students could continue to learn during COVID?
Thank you very much, Representative Omar. Yes, I think one thing that I must say is the leadership. His Excellency President Julius Maada Bio made education his priority. And so in 2018, we're at 19% of our budget, and then we went to 20%, 21%, and we decided that we have to keep expanding the percentage of our budgets to education until we can reach our targets. So it was really a leadership decision and understanding that our only way out of this and preparation for this pandemic is through public education. So we had to keep investing. Some of the things that we did was we brought back all the kids who were in transition classes, gave them dry rations, and made sure that they did their examinations 5 months after schools closed. We expanded education radio. So now, as we speak, we bought transmitters and hoping to ensure that all across the country, people can continue learning with education radio. And with the new EGMA study shows that about 87% of kids listen to education radio. We also printed materials. We know that not everybody has access to technology, so we printed materials and mailed it to communities who were hard to reach and who were not in radio reach or who could not have TV. And we built mobile systems, right? So 87% of the population has access to mobile connectivity. So we built SMS, USSD solutions that we made available to poor kids as well. So it's really a combination. What we have, what we call hybrid technology solutions within the Directorate of Science, Technology, and Innovation. So things that work on paper, online, offline, mobile, that we really extended.
Okay, excellent. And are there ways we could use some of these programs as a model for policies we should support in other countries in Africa and in the developing world?
Thank you. I think it's a great question. By the way, something as well I think the U.S. can do is be part of what we call the digital public goods. It's a platform that we have with the United Nations, with UNICEF, and within the digital public good framework, it's that we should build technologies and solutions that should be shared across the world. And I think the U.S., being a leading technology country, should see how it can be part of these global networks that create solutions for sharing for everybody. I do think investing in education and data technology, edtech, in ways that was not what we imagined before, but rather that is inclusive, that does not leave poor communities out, that does not leave women and girls out, is something that you can invest in a little bit more.
Thank you so much. Ms. Sherif, does the United States provide enough assistance for education to refugees and displaced children? And what more could we be doing? As you know, I was a child in a refugee camp for 4 years and missed the opportunity to be educated in those 4 years.
Vänta.
Ms. Sherif, are you there?
Yes. Hold on. Sorry. I'm here.
Okay, did you hear the question? Do you want me to repeat it?
Please repeat it. I'm so sorry.
I was asking if you thought the United States provides enough assistance for education to refugees and displaced children, and what more could we be doing? As you probably know, I was a child in a refugee camp in Kenya for 4 years and missed the opportunity to be fully educated while I was there.
Yeah, we did a special COVID-19 response where Kenya was included because we host a large number of refugees. So they have definitely provided support directly to Kenya. We have also worked very closely with the US in Burkina Faso, in Cameroon, and many other places. And the US, especially, so the way the US provide money to ECW, Education Cannot Wait, is one is to our trust fund in New York, and then they provide money in country because you have the USAID missions in country. So they're always part of Education Cannot Wait's programs, and so across the Sahel and in Kenya, and refugee education. PRM has been very strong in refugee education. So yes, my answer is yes. The US is often very flexible, very fast, very speedy.
All right, thank you so much. My time has expired, and I will now recognize Mr. Berra for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me direct the first question to Mr. Kaufman. I'm still on faculty at the University of California, Davis, and I've had conversations with both my chancellor, but also the University of California system in general, and have thought about the utility of how we take the talent that we have within our university system, but make that accessible to, to the rest of the world, whether that's, in the farming agriculture sector or climate change, et cetera. And what I've explored with them is, we're able to interact in a virtual setting right now. Is there a way for us to build capacity so it's not that those students who are graduating now have to travel abroad and attend university, in another country, but can we, in a virtual setting, and are there any examples where U.S. universities in a virtual setting are taking their talent, partnering with institutions in Africa and in various countries, and doing some of that online training, which may ultimately lead to their students studying in the United States or elsewhere? And can we do that in a low-cost way that takes the talent and builds capacity in some of these countries? And Mr. Kaufman, maybe the question's for you.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, first of all, a few things. I think that online support, both for teacher training and for students, is a super efficient and effective way to expand opportunities. It's expensive to bring people and travel around the world. So I think there's more we can do that. And if you're looking at ways to help share the expertise of UC Davis faculty and students, then we need it. And I think schools all around the continent need it. The truth is, in a place like Somaliland and in many other fragile settings, we don't yet have the cadre of qualified teachers who are proficient in contemporary pedagogical strategies. So until we bring them up to speed through support with different programs that you and others have mentioned, we're going to struggle to promote learning among kids. So the more support we can get from people like your colleagues and students would be great. And the more we can expand digital access would be really helpful. And if I can, just a super quick response to Representative Ilhan Omar's question about does the US government do enough? I mean, the answer is no. I'm grateful for all the support of the US government, and you have done a lot. The US government has made opportunities possible that otherwise would not have existed, but we need to do more. The risks are too great, not just in fragile settings, but for spillover that can drive violent extremism if we don't give people a reason to hope and other opportunities.
Great. Let me ask a quick question to Ms. Winthrop. One of the areas that I've done some work is thinking about global fragility and fragile states in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the best strategies is that investment in women and girls. Pregnancy spacing, providing full reproductive access, but also that investment in girls' education. I think you mentioned that in your opening statement. When I was in Sierra Leone a few years ago, I also had a chance to visit some care-sponsored programs that were targeting boys and fathers, which I think if we want to get the full capacity of girls' education, we also have to start with boys. So as those girls become young women, and those boys become young men, there's that value and that recognition. And I don't know, Ms. Winthrop, if you want to touch on that and how we can't forget about educating boys.
Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, it's true that if you educating women and girls, especially up through secondary education, has such good ripple effects across a community. But I have seen running programs on girls' education myself. If you really just focus on the girls and leave out the boys, you'll have a backlash and you'll undermine your work. But also, certainly our scholars who we work with on girls' education around the world are saying the next frontier is really to make sure that boys are brought into the conversation around gender equality. It's no point in having a really empowered group of women if the men, their counterparts and peers, aren't right there beside them lockstep. So I think that is the next frontier for sure.
Great. Thank you. And I see my time's expired, so I'll go back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Jacobs for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Vice Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I want to start with Dr. Winthrop. Thank you for talking about directly supporting local organizations in your testimony. I absolutely agree and think that we can do much more on this and that there are plenty of local organizations that the U.S. can and should support. So I was hoping you could highlight some successful examples of USAID doing this well in the education sector in certain African countries, and maybe also describe the issue a little more with governments and partners wanting to find funding for their solutions without the many competing priorities that come with donors.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We hear a lot about this from our decades of work with African partners. One of the things we hear, and I'm sure Minister Sengeh can attest to this, is that it's very hard to navigate the competing donor partners, the US government priorities, the UK's priorities, EU's priorities, multilateral's priorities. And that's part of why GP is so helpful, because they pool everybody together. And frequently what we hear is that folks on the ground feel like they don't get a say in what the strategy really is. And we've heard a lot about sort of flipping, the USAID is beginning to move in this direction, where they've, rather than giving, basically the tradition has been, and I think they've been mandated to do it for some time, fund international US American organizations to go forth and maybe then find African partners to support implementing. There are, like in Malawi, this organization CRACOM, which is a community-based organization nationally across the country, is now getting direct funding and helping to design some girls' education empowerment work. And it's highly, highly effective because they work with local tribal leaders to try to change gender norms, which really only they can do. So I really think what we're hearing and what we've been doing with our partner is trying to flip the narrative, where international organizations who have lots of expertise, lots of things to offer, including universities that we've talked about, come in behind local organizations to try to hear what their ideas are for the solution and try to lend global expertise, including something we hear a lot about, are sharing across borders. That's a great thing for international groups to do. What are my peers in Africa doing, or in Latin America, et cetera. And we've been doing a lot of exchange of innovative scalable models that was mentioned before. Some great, amazing strategies on expanding and scaling quality secondary education in the Amazon jungle, really useful for remote areas of sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So that the US government is just taking baby steps in this direction, in my opinion. So I would encourage it to keep going and lean in even more.
Well, thank you. I want to move to Minister Sengeh. I appreciated that you talked about the digital public goods platform. I actually helped work on that when I worked at UNICEF and as the CEO of Project Connect, which is now part of the GIGA project, which I know you all in Sierra Leone are working on as well. But I wanted to ask you about how we can think about what we should be teaching these kids. Many schools in Africa still focus on the sort of old colonial rote memorization model. So it's not enough just to get bodies into schools, but make sure we're teaching them the right thing. And even when we're doing the more sort of tech focused, it's often just teaching a specific coding language that frankly will be obsolete by the time they graduate and go into the workforce. So how are you thinking about what skills these kids really need, and how can we do more to invest in these kinds of education practices?
It's an excellent question. And I think this is also linked to, again, back to the president's vision on human capital development. In Sierra Leone, one of the things we've done, and this is much more difficult to do in other countries, is changing the curriculum whole frame. So we've been able to change the civics curriculum, we've been able to change the basic education, the early childhood development, and the secondary school curriculum. We have what we call the 5 C's: critical thinking, creativity, civics, computational thinking, and comprehension. If you're teaching computational thinking, then you're not teaching coding with just one language. You're helping the child learn how to think. If you're thinking comprehension, you're going beyond literacy. Certainly the child needs to be literate, but it's about whether they understand. And the value of education, what we teach them is that they should be problem solvers, and they should be creative, and that they should participate in civic life. So for us in Sierra Leone, it's these 5 C's that we go with, and we're thinking beyond just what literacy and numeracy means.
Thank you. And Madam Vice Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Muser for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. Thank you to Ranking Member Smith as well. So a very important subject, glad to be a part of it. Africa's demographics alone certainly underscore the need to make impactful investments in African education now. The data shows that in the next 30 years, the working population in sub-Saharan Africa is expected to double, accounting for 2/3 of the world's total population growth. And Africa's development depends on this predominantly young and growing population to be as practically educated and scientifically educated, I guess we could say, as possible. Mr. Kaufman, I'll start with you. Thanks for being here. You mentioned that your schools develop curriculum in coordination with local private sector employers. Certainly, that's done in the U.S. as well. Love to hear a little bit more of your creativity and synergies that you create on how Abaarso tailors the curriculum and training students to ensure students are prepared for jobs, entrepreneurship, and of course, future higher education. So if you would, Mr. Kaufman, maybe elaborate some.
Yes, thank you. I so appreciate you coming back to the Abaarso Network on that. To begin with, our students who go to the Abaarso school, the secondary school, the key to making sure they're prepared for a changing, dynamic, and competitive global world, and in order to come back to Somaliland and make a difference, we have to keep the standards as high as we would for anyone else around the world. We can't say, well, we're in a difficult place. We're in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm so glad that more kids are going to school and that they're reading at a higher level. We need to keep the standard at proficiency and readiness to compete on the world stage. And our graduates from the Abaarso School are doing just that. And they're coming back and starting businesses, working for various ministries. The other part of that is the liaison that we have with the university and our own network. So the 15 women who graduated and are now working in our primary schools, we've been watching and monitoring this year. Well, how are they doing? Are they good teachers? Are they reliable professionals? And the early returns have been fantastic. They are some of our best and most dedicated teaching staff. And we fully expect that some of them will go on to lead additional schools. But we need to greatly expand our throughput on graduates from the university, because unless there are more great teachers available, we can only expand as quickly as we can grow great teachers, or other partners can. You asked about our creativity. So when I went around and spoke with CEOs from around the country and asked them, who are you going to be hiring for? What do you need? As one quick example, the director of the bottling plant that owns the Coke franchise in Somaliland said, well, they need quality assessors, people who are expert in planning and processes. So we said, well, give us your forms, give us your tools, and we'll make that part of our curriculum at our School of Management. We don't need to create a program in the abstract or that's theoretical. It can be specifically for their program or for their workforce.
Well, you know what? You're really doing some great work. Congratulations, really, to all of you. It's so important. Do you offer semesters abroad and any sort of student exchange?
We send some of our students, they get scholarships to go to secondary schools in the United States, but we also are very happy to receive students and young professionals who want to take a gap year or have a program to support and teach or learn teaching in our schools. We provide about 3 to 4 weeks of professional development before the school year starts with everybody in country. So if we've got really smart, super dedicated young people, we're ready to help them make a difference in our classrooms.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Let us know on the semesters abroad opportunities. Maybe we can be helpful within our districts or within our state. But it really, congratulations for your enthusiasm and the important work that all of you are doing. And I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I think that concludes our first round of questions. I have some follow-up for the second round. If any member has or wants to do that as well, please flag it for me. I just wanted to begin with Mr. Kaufman. Earlier, you said that there was more the United States could do. Can you give us maybe 2 or 3 examples of ways the United States could be more helpful in regards to investment in education?
Yes, thank you. The U.S., I think, can mobilize some of its partners, of which it is a major shareholder, from different multilateral banks and government partners, to make sure that they're providing support to the most proven models that are scalable. I've worked in the nonprofit and humanitarian community for a long time, and I know that a lot of inertia can build up within that community, and sometimes we struggle to make creative use of those finances, and they keep going to the same people for the same things to little effect. So I think the US government can really incentivize and influence how those dollars are spent so that more money can go to things that work and that we scale them.
Thank you. And Dr. Winthrop, I wanted to ask you about USAID's distribution of textbooks and other school materials, especially in the context of the shift to locally driven programming that you talked about. How does USAID ensure that these materials are student-centered, meaning available in local languages and are covering appropriate subjects? And how will USAID's localization strategy affect the provisions of these materials?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure I have the full answer because I don't think I have a super great grasp on exactly what they're doing in textbook and materials distribution. But what I can tell you from what I do know from my experience is that, you know, while there is a general strategy in USAID, everything is run through the country office. So, you know, mother tongue instruction is definitely high on the list. And it is one of the most effective ways of ensuring young people can learn to read, because often children are being asked to come to school and learn in a language that they don't even know how to read. And I know USAID is very much on top of that, and they are focused on mother tongue instruction in multiple languages. I wonder if you're also getting at this question of, if you were to support local African groups and bringing the international community behind them, you know, what might be some of the new strategies that USAID should take? And to me, I think, you know, partners that we work with on the ground, are the things that they ask for are often very technical, like come tell us the latest evidence on from the learning sciences and how we can apply it, and less about how to implement, roll out, and understanding the contextual nuance of a country. Okay. I do think that USAID could be very helpful in coming behind folks on the ground who often have more creative ideas of how the different assets in their communities can be put together to really accelerate change. And not, that is, I think, the single biggest shift that would really be helpful, because often the US government comes in with a solution, you're going to do this, etc.
Thank you. And Ms. Sherif, I was very interested in your point about COVID teaching us a valuable lesson in how to provide education in extremely difficult circumstances. What are some of the COVID-related programs that could be in use for other situations?
Yeah, I think how we respond to COVID-19 depends on the context. And when we speak about Africa, we have the poorest infrastructure there to use technology, because we often speak about the need of technology. And that works in countries like Lebanon, where you have an infrastructure. But when you go to countries like Mali, Central African Republic, they don't have infrastructure even for Wi-Fi. So to shift, I would say, also our resources to ensure that these countries can build an infrastructure that allows for technology to respond to remote learning is going to be very, very important. You know, you have to flesh out a little bit of the resource distribution on the globe, to be honest, because you go into a place, and I've been to camps and IDP camps in places like Mali or Burkina Faso. I mean, they don't even have electricity. So now, how do you install Wi-Fi? How do you move on to technological solutions? We are dealing with very, very primordial situations where there is nothing available. So not to always look at technology as the only answer.
Thank you.
That's number one. But one more thing I would like to say, what is going to be very important, and we see a very strong US leadership here, and the US has two big interests, and the current administration especially. a strong United Nations and strong delivery in the education sector. Now, as a UN fund, we are a living example of how you can cut bureaucracy and show for more accountability. And when we delivered in COVID-19, the moment the pandemic was declared, we actually picked up Martin Luther King's quote, "The fears urgently on now," and we moved faster than most in delivering a response. So I would say more funding and trust that our entrepreneurship and our less bureaucracy actually deliver results on the ground, bringing all actors together, ending the competition, and deliver real results.
We're out of time. I don't see any other members who want to ask questions. And before I adjourn, I wanted to see if you all can do 1 minute of closing remarks, and we will start with Minister Sengeh.
Thank you very much. I mean, I do think, as I said, our most powerful weapon, if not our silver bullet to solving the world's intractable problems, is public education. Quality public education is our only way of ensuring that we achieve inclusion, that we are better prepared to face pandemics of the future, and that we can help our children learn what they need to learn to fulfill their human potential, to participate in the global economy, and also to have great civic life. And that's what we have to do, is support quality public education everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kaufman?
Thank you, yes. First, I want to respond really quickly to Ms. Jacobs' question about what should we teach in class. I talked a lot about the relationship between the private sector and schools. And there's a great study that I've been carrying around for 7 years from McKinsey that noted that while there's 800 million unemployed youth, the vast majority of private sector companies, or at least close to 50% of them, say that they can't find people, young people who are qualified for entry-level jobs. That disconnect is devastating and driving youth unemployment. So one of my big takeaways is continue to recognize that schools are more than just buildings. We need to make them part of communities, part of a dynamic economic system and infrastructure, and that we have to incentivize and generate demand and ensure good quality. Invest in the programs that have evidence of success, whether it's Abaarso or anyone else. Thank you.
Dr. Winthrop?
Well, I would just second both what Minister Sengeh and Mr. Kaufman said. I think those are great. I agree with all of it. And I think the final thing I would urge the committee to think about is, there are lots of good examples. Someone asked about scalable examples of what works that are out there from different parts of the world that could work, both within Sub-Saharan Africa, but from outside Sub-Saharan Africa, that could really be applied to effectively accelerate the pace of change and much more quickly close these big inequality gaps, part of which Mr. Kaufman referenced. And to me, this idea of leapfrogging at the core is to really think creatively about how to bring, whether it's employers to bear, technology companies to bear, communities to bear, all in this effort of educating kids. We've seen really effective models of that being done. And I agree that opening the mind and then investing in scaling is the best way to get the job done.
Thank you. Ms. Sherif?
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to just lift up one incredible program where USAID really played an instrumental role, and that is the first ever refugee education response plan in Uganda when you had refugees coming from South Sudan. And the USAID played an instrumental role in making this one of the successful investments of education cannot wait, and has continued throughout the Sahel and other countries. You have incredibly strong USAID officers on the ground. They are there to determine the strategic focus, moving and shaking everyone else to work together. And I think the besides the strategic contribution, the Uganda Refugee Response Plan is a great example in time, is financing and bring in the private sector. Private sector together with governmental resources can make that difference. It's not impossible. Strong people, financing, private sector, and we can turn the tide around. Nothing is impossible. We can do it.
I just want to thank all of our panelists and our colleagues for participating in this wonderful discussion today. I want to thank Chairwoman Karen Bass and Ranking Member Smith. You know, my father used to say education is the greatest equalizer. And if we want to create a more equitable world, we have to make sure that we're investing in the education and the well-being of every child in every corner of the world. So thank you all. This meeting is adjourned.